It had been a day of collecting things. Katie found out that if you hold a red, yellow, and orange leaf together in your hand, it makes a bright-colored fan. Orbie learned that a windy day was especially good for picking up pine cones to make decorations. And they both discovered that you have to be fast collecting acorn hats because squirrels are the fastest collectors of all. Dad had to do some work. And when he was finished, they were going to go down to Mac's garage to pump up the tires on the car. Katie and Orbie were very excited about this. They played quietly while Dad wrote things down and looked things up. First, they were wild animal photographers. Then they played dress-up. A little later, they pretended to dig holes right through the earth. They talked about what they wanted to do when they grew up, and they were very busy, not bothering Dad, so he could get his work done. But I have to tell you that by the time they'd done all of that, they certainly were ready to go down to the garage and watch Dad and Mac blow up the tires. When they asked Dad if he was nearly finished, he nodded his head. He told them he would only be a few more minutes, and this was music to their ears. Katie and Orbie quickly threw on their jackets and stood by the door. But Dad kept working. After a couple of minutes, Katie slipped into the room and asked Dad if he was ready yet. He nodded his head without looking up and told her again it would be a few more minutes. Katie smiled and went back to the front door to tell Orbie. Orbie was a bit tired of standing by the door and wanted to encourage Dad to hurry, so he slid on his tummy like a snake into the room and onto Dad's table. Dad chuckled and asked him to keep the snake out of the dining room. It might mix up his papers. The Orbie snake slid out as Dad called out that it would only be a few more minutes. Katie got so hot sitting in the front hall with her jacket on that she finally took it off. Then she whispered in Orbie's ear. She had a great plan. They tiptoed up the stairs and got her fishing rod and some paper and crayons. They drew a picture of a big tire. Back in the dining room, something floated over Dad's head and in front of his face. Dad laughed at the funny tire picture, and he told him that he was almost done, just a few more minutes. He waved away the picture so he could see what he was doing. In the front hall, Katie and Orbie sat patiently. A few more minutes sure could take a long, long time. At the dining room table, Dad worked away and didn't seem to notice the two friends waiting at the door. Orbie was fiddling with Dad's keychain. It made a jingling sound, and Orbie sat up and looked like he'd thought of the very most amazing thing. Katie asked what it was. Orbie burbled that maybe if a parade walked through the dining room, Dad would be sure to follow. He shot up the stairs. When Orbie was dressed up in a silly hat with his marching drum around his neck and Katie was in her clown suit with her trumpet, they looked at each other. Something wasn't quite right. A parade usually had more than two people in it. Orbie looked over at Katie's stuffies and they both giggled. In a minute, they had a teddy behind Orbie and a big doll behind Katie. They held them on with belts. In a line, they looked like four people, a real parade. The parade trumpeted and drummed itself down the stairs right into the dining room. It went all around the table twice, and Dad smiled, but he didn't really look up. I have to tell you that Katie and Orbie were now a little annoyed that Dad wasn't noticing them. But I have to add that Dad was trying really very hard to finish his work. When Katie and Orbie marched out of the room, they were not very happy. How could Dad not notice a parade? They sat on the kitchen chairs and tried to figure out how to get his attention. After all, more than a few minutes were already up for sure. Orbie looked around the room and saw Mom's great big soup pot sitting in the drying rack. What if, he burbled, Katie sang a silly song about going to get the tire changed, and he played the soup pot like a drum. The song would remind Dad, and the pot would be much louder than his little drum. Orbie figured this amazing idea would work. So he and Katie made up a silly song, and when she had memorized all the words and could sing it without giggling, Orbie picked up an old soup ladle and the pot, and together they tiptoed into the dining room. I don't think Dad even heard them. If he did, he didn't look up. He was just on the very last number when Orbie struck the pot, and the noise was so loud and surprised Dad so much that the pencil he was writing with flipped into the air and across the room. Katie sang her song, and Orbie kept the beat. Dad smiled and told them he was all ready and would meet them in the hall in 2 minutes. He just had to put his books away. Orbie zipped out of the room so fast, the pencil spun on the floor. Katie tried to catch up with him. When Dad popped his head into the living room to see if they were sitting on the couch, Katie and Orbie jumped up from behind the couch and said and tooted, "Boo!" Dad laughed again. At Mac's garage, Dad told the story of how Katie and Orbie had tried to get his attention. Mac pumped the air into the tire as the air machine dinged. Mac looked at Dad. He said he thought Katie and Orbie must have had more fun in those last few more minutes than they'd had all day. The friends looked at each other. Mac was right. Katie and Orbie had had a ball waiting for Dad. Mac told him next time he'd have to take a little longer. Katie and Orbie groaned and then giggled. And I hope if you have to wait for someone, that you'll remember Katie and Orbie, and that waiting can be as much fun as what you are waiting for.
Did you know? There's some pretty funny-looking things underwater. A sponge is really a sea creature. A jellyfish is a see-through fish with tons of legs. And a sea cucumber doesn't taste like a real one. This is a seahorse. Imagine that, a horse with no legs.